Everyone, welcome to our webinar, Getting Back to a New Normal, Repurposing Public Space. I'm Lilia Cabral-Bernard, one of the many planners and the Title VI coordinator here at SRPEDD. Thank you for joining us today for the first webinar SRPEDD is hosting as part of the COVID-19 Outreach Series. Before we begin, I just want to go over some housekeeping and some protocol for asking questions. If you have a question, you can type in the Q&A box at any time. And if the question is for someone in particular, please include that in the question so we can direct it to the person it needs to go to. We'll get to those as we can, as well as recognize questions from the raise hands feature in your control panel at the end of the presentations. We'll try to email our participants list dialing in from your phone. So if you would like AICP credits, please contact us after the webinar. Thank you. Also, we are recording this. Just want to be aware of that. We are recording this webinar. So just a few things about SRPEDD. We are the regional planning agency for 27 cities and towns in southeastern Massachusetts. We have a broad range of comprehensive and transportation-related capabilities and a very long history of providing technical assistance to our communities. That assistance is offered as grant writing, applications, both traffic and transit studies, long-range planning, and economic development, to name a few. We're happy to partner with VHB for this webinar to compare experiences and to connect with our communities. I will now turn this over to Jeffrey Morrison-Logan, the New England Regional Director at VHB. Take it away, Jeffrey.
Great, thanks, Lil. Really appreciate that introduction. And all I just wanted to say as we get started today, just how excited we are to be joining the conversation and sharing some thoughts. We very much see this as a two-way conversation for this entire webinar. I know we have a lot of great panelists that are ready to dive into the conversation and really bring some of the best practices to all of the different communities here. And for me, from a personal perspective and background, being a planner and urban designer, communities, main streets, and the heart of their downtowns is something that I've always been really, really passionate about. So for me, over the last few months, as we've all been going through COVID-19 issues, it's just really been striking to see all of the transformations that all of our communities are dealing with and responding to in real time. And I think hopefully at the end of our conversation today, we're gonna have a lot that we can react to and hopefully help each other to continue to move forward to be stronger on the back end of this as we get through this pandemic. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation. With that, Lizette, I'm going to hand it off to you if you want to give us the formal introduction and talk about our agenda. So Lizette. And you're on mute, Lizette, just as a reminder. Yep.
Thank you, Jeff. If we can move to the next slide to show the agenda, that would be great, and then I can get right into it. Thank you. So just to do a quick overview of how we'll run the webinar, I'll go into some survey results that we sent out a couple weeks ago to our local communities. I'll hand it off to Jeff and Patricia Dombigan from VHB to talk about statewide examples of placemaking in public spaces. And then I'll hand it off to Tabitha Harkins, City Planning Director in New Bedford, to talk about how they're already implementing some of these practices. We'll move on to Kenneth Buckland from Wareham to discuss how they're planning on implementing their own innovative proposals. And finally, we'll introduce Kate Fitcher from MassDOT, the Assistant Secretary for Policy Coordination, to discuss the Shared Streets and Public Spaces grant funding opportunity. So next slide. Just to give you guys an overview, we sent out a quick survey to our communities to gather the experiences, challenges, and general community responses to COVID. More than half of our communities responded, and overwhelmingly a majority presented challenges in regards to the fiscal outlook, the uncertainty of what the future might look like in 6 months to a year, and possibly further, challenges associated with public engagement and the implementation of social distancing measures. In line with that, they are still continuing to reach out to their constituencies through virtual meetings, email, web alerts, Facebook. So we're getting very creative in that sense. And I'm sure we're all familiar with some of these strategies by now. When asked how they've responded to their community needs, our member cities and towns said they were largely focusing on access to food and medical care, ensuring that these basic needs are met in order to ensure people's lives continue moving forward. As they should. In addition to that, they talked about extending tax due dates to alleviate possibly some impacts from unemployment, that type of thing, and providing temporary zoning permits to help small businesses, and in line with that, also conducting outreach to them. Looking towards the future and how else we can assist our communities, we asked what else they wanted to learn about, and here we talked about public health initiatives, how to support them, how to start them up, conducting outreach programs for small business assistance, considering infrastructure maintenance and how to partner with the private sector. And then to get into this idea of adapting public spaces, they talked about maybe pop-up programs for vacant space or outdoor space, adapting parking requirements for local centers. So those are some of the results from the survey. To talk more about what these examples might look like and how these strategies work, I'm going to hand it off to Jeff and Trish from VHB to talk about some statewide examples.
Excellent. Well, thanks for that, Lizeth. So again, Jeffrey Morse, Logan, VHB. I'm going to be joined with Patricia Domigan from our company here, and she's the director of our municipal services at VHB, and has done a lot of work with me throughout Massachusetts in many communities in terms of their downtowns and their main streets. And in terms of thinking about some more of the regional and statewide initiatives, we'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the case studies. We've had a chance to go out and photograph some of the communities. We always thought it's helpful to share some of these best practices by seeing them virtually together here as well. So we'll share a little bit about what we're seeing in the field, talk a little about some best practices that we're seeing, and hopefully that should shed some light on how we can all move forward. So if we go to the next slide, please. So what's interesting, and I'm sure we've all seen this over the last few months in particular, I just try to capture a few of the headlines and what's in the news, even just some of the topics that are out there. Clearly, worldwide, we're dealing with the COVID pandemic. And what does that mean towards how we're operating our communities, providing the critical services, thinking about our main streets from health perspectives, mobility perspectives, economic development perspective. And it's just interesting to see some of these headlines across the country and throughout the world, and how we're really quickly trying to get into these ways that we can open up some of our main streets, change the way that we think about them in terms of slowing down the traffic, repurposing them as healthy streets, really trying to get rid of all the traffic volume that would be from cars, but doing it in a way that provides access, parking, and still safe movements for vehicles and fire access and so forth. But also this idea that we're very much in this exploration mode. If you think about in terms of planning initiatives and trends over the years in your careers, I think what's interesting right now is we're living through this incubator period where we're really learning this real time as we explore this together. Next slide. So what we thought we would do here is just show you a couple of quick case studies to get the ideas flowing here. I'm not sure if folks know about Waltham, Massachusetts. It has a wonderful downtown that frankly has emerged over the last 10 to 15 years as a very prominent destination. It's right on the Charles River, very proximate to downtown Boston. We go on to the next slide, please. What's been great about this as a location and as an example here, and to give the city a lot of credit, is they've carefully thought about the repurposing of their main street, Moody Street in particular, through the collateral that they've developed to advertise to the public where the actual closures are taking place, what are some of the policies, how do you navigate, how transit might need to be relocated on a temporary basis, just to get the community ready to really utilize that resource in a very different way. Next slide, please. What they've also done is they've been able to identify all of the businesses along that main street in terms of about 25, 26 of them, where they're located, how the street closures really play into this becoming a repurposed place for the downtown, and also recognize that people are going to walk, bike, as well as drive downtown, show them where the critical operations and the bus, as well as where the parking is located in the entire downtown network. Next slide. So as we go from the kind of south side up through the north towards the Charles River, we wanted to show you a couple of images there. So note how they've actually shown from a traffic perspective, the detours and the rerouting. Note here how they put in the barriers to be able to blockade the street there as well. Next slide. As we zoom in closer, you can see that obviously it starts to feel like there's something special going on in this place here. Knowing that they've got 25, 26 different restaurants, how do you actually set it up in a way that this street can really come to life with all those different activities, knowing that people want to vie for having the outdoor dining that's really required as an option versus some of the indoor limitations that COVID-19 has posed for all of us as well. Next slide. So as we get into this, what was striking to me when I took these pictures on a Sunday afternoon, I thought it'd be great if there's more people, but also without the people, you get to see a little bit of how this is set up from a technical perspective. Notice that all of the chairs are separated here. Notice that there's actually orange lines going down the side of the double yellow lines down the main street here to set up as a zone. Next slide. What was interesting, it's almost as if this community had a competition, frankly, block by block, building storefront by building storefront, to be able to really bring this design into the street and make it a very rich and diverse experience. Next slide. So as we go through these, also notice that there's preserved space going down the middle of the street here, potentially for fire access and for emergency vehicles. Also notice the level of structures that are being built there, especially this example on the left here. It brings the question, the idea of building structures within the street, parklets, and actually tying it back to architecture as well. Next slide. Also here, it's just interesting to notice that people are utilizing the sidewalk as well as where people were parking before. It does bring to issue the ideas about access. Where do you get into these places? How does a sidewalk get treated in terms of ADA accessibility? Next slide. Also in terms of not just for restaurants, how are businesses actually funneling out into the street as well? Pretty good example here of farmers market and be able to walk up and get fresh food and products as well. Next slide. And what that looks like in terms of how they pretty quickly put their whole pallets together to have a platform to sell their goods. Next slide. As well as some other locations that might not be as intense in terms of the design feature, but equally important in terms of the capacity, the spacing, and the fundamentals. Next slide. And you can see this as we go up and down this corridor, that there's a lot of different examples about how they're treating and utilizing that space as well. Next slide. So what's interesting to me, while those orange lines are existing in the sidewalk here, as you go up and down this corridor, depending on the uses that are next door, I would say the success of this as a place varies, and because of where those different activities are as well. Next slide. And as we transition here, knowing that those barricades, those directions, those signage quickly become important about keeping people separated and safe. Next slide. And what's interesting, and as you go through maybe the next couple here, Lisa, as well, just scroll through them, just the idea that the details matter, how you celebrate identity, programming uses, and then if you stop at the next slide here, I think some of the less successful parts of the places where it was an integrated street, but if you can barely tell that there's the opportunity to dine behind some of those concrete barriers there, but just the idea of design still is pretty important in these spaces as well. Next one. I think the last couple examples that we show here, this is in Framingham and Ashland, a little bit further west of Boston. If you go on to the next slide, the importance of signage in here. And this is a photo that we took that actually shows the importance about takeout and the restrictions on indoor dining here as well. And Framingham was able to brand these signs, get them out on the street, and allocate temporary parking for those patrons as well. Next slide. And the last part that I'd just like to offer up for conversation is the idea that this is happening in many locations in retail centers. This is one of the better examples I found in Ashland, where it's taking over an entire parking lot. If you go on to the next slide, it's programming it to anticipate people arriving, proper signage, and having this outdoor experience in terms of dining as well, and accommodate that in a very socially distanced way. Next slide. And the last couple of things I just want to remind us as planners and urban designers and advocates of these types of things is just posing that question about what do you have from your community's perspective in terms of your tools and the programs. There's a lot of different things that we do as planners and urban designers, and the plans that we do. All of these things, I would argue, touch upon how we shape public space and the importance of those. So the question I have is, do you have all of these in your inventory? Are you actively using them? And in light of COVID-19 and health issues, how are you really responding to some of those as well? Next slide. And the last thing I'll bring up before handing off to Trish is this idea that healthy mobility has really become a trend in the last couple of years. At VHB, we've actually been developing a healthy mobility model. The goal of that is really just to try to advance some of the thinking around some of these topics, really share the results about health data with different communities, and making sure that as we're planning for the communities, health, both mental, physical, is really important to the success of communities, to the point that recently we've seen comprehensive plans include a healthy communities chapter in those plans as well. So with that, Trish, I'll hand it off to you to talk about some of the technical things and things not to forget when you're doing these types of studies. Next slide.
Thanks, Jeffrey. I sound like such a Debbie Downer after that presentation. You know, communities are just really thinking out of the box and really being creative in the way that they're actually repurposing transportation corridors that were mostly used for vehicles in the past. But there are some things that you have to think about logistically if you're going to do that. You know, some of the things, especially with some of the images that Jeffrey just showed, was, you know, emergency vehicles really need to access the roadway systems to make sure that police and fire can get into the areas that they need to get into safely, and make sure that pedestrians and cyclists are out of the way so that they can just move in and out efficiently. So some of the things that we've been helping communities out with are putting together checklists. So, you know, as they're progressing into shared streets and shifting the purposes of these public spaces, you know, some of the things that they have to think about as they're implementing it is who owns the roadway. You know, is it a public way? Is it local to the community, or is it state owned? And if it is state owned, then you have to work with MassDOT, the owners of the roadway, to make sure that it's accessible and it makes sense to actually change the use of the road. The functional classification, so I'm just going to go through this really quickly. The functional classification, the actual roadway volumes, you know, as Jeffrey pointed out in Waltham, there were essentially detour routes that actually navigated traffic around the areas of closed roadways. And you really have to think about, okay, if I'm putting a number of vehicles through a neighborhood roadway that isn't typically used to seeing that amount of traffic, are there any implications to that? Can all of the major trucks that are using those neighborhoods, can they navigate the roadways safely and not have to, you know, go into the other travel lane or go onto the sidewalks to make those moves at intersections? As I mentioned, it's really important to make sure that you can continue to have emergency response, you know, fire, police, ambulance, get into the areas that are shifting from one mode of transportation to the other. On-street parking, you know, especially with central business districts, you know, on-street parking is really super important. And, you know, it's great to have outside dining, but you have to be cognizant that people do have to get there unless they can walk there. So, you know, off-street parking, on-street parking, maybe some public-private parking shares in private parking lots is something to consider as you're developing these shared streets. Truck routes, as I mentioned, you have to make sure that whatever you're doing, even if it's on a temporary basis, that the size of the vehicle can actually navigate the route that you're considering. And also, if you want to report back, you know, if you want to think about, okay, this makes sense on a permanent basis, should you actually take a look at the amount of traffic that may have been using the routes before? What happens? What's the long-term implication of changing a street to maybe closing it off to vehicles completely or narrowing it? And, you know, what would that road diet really mean if the traffic does start increasing and people are navigating around those closed roadways? Next slide. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to New Bedford.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tabitha Harkin. I am the City Planning Director for the City of New Bedford, and thank you for having me here and having me present on behalf of the city. I was proud to be co-chair of the city's restaurant reopening group that the mayor put together in late May, and that was a successful collaboration between public and private partners with the mission of recommending guidance. You can go to the next slide, actually. So this is the mission statement. We developed a mission statement to start us off, and that group consisted of a cross-section of local restaurateurs. You can go to the next slide. A cross-section of local restaurateurs, city department heads, city councilors. City councilors were a huge help in this. And then particularly, I wanted to thank the local department heads that are working alongside me every day, and that's the people from public infrastructure, that's the building department, that's the health department, licensing, and the mayor's office, of course. We're all working hand in hand on this to really expedite permitting and temporary outdoor seating in the city. So this is just a list of some of the invited restaurateurs. And my co-chair was Steve Silverstein, who's the founder of Not Your Average Joe's. You've probably seen their restaurant chain across the state. And he's also a local restaurateur to the Black Whale in New Bedford, and a recently opened clam shack that's pretty cool. Next slide. So what we did to start this group was that we set up a working group share drive so that everybody could access that. We met weekly, bi-weekly even, with subcommittees, and formed 4 buckets. So we had an outreach team, we had a streets and sidewalks team, we had a regulations and permitting team, and an operations team. So those teams all participated within this group share to look at Mass state guidelines, which were required. We collaborated and gathered best practices and templates from other cities and towns, recently passed COVID legislation. We had solicitors' guidance throughout, which was really helpful. We have a great city solicitor staff. So when we were interpreting those regulations and what was coming down from the state, it was very helpful to have people to bounce those things off of. And then we had pertinent news articles. Things were coming out every day. So especially in early June, it was just hurried checking out what everyone else was doing and seeing what we could do to pick up those best practices and present it to the mayor. Next slide. So we put out a survey. We started with restaurants and we expanded it to the entire community. So the EDC, our partners in this at the city level, the economic development the economic development arm of the city, they put out a survey that had 57 responses and several emails. So people were looking for patio dining, said they wouldn't be able to open without serving alcohol. So in the past, we've only gotten a handful of sidewalk cafe permits. So this year we're looking at just about 35 at this point. So this is before all of that came in to even figure out what restaurants needed, what restaurants were looking to do. So you can go to the next slide. So what this slide does is I had one of my staff, Kirsten Bryan, map this to show us which restaurants were hit on. And the city of New Bedford, we have several nodes. We have our downtown, which is our primary tourist district. And then we have the Love the Ave, the international marketplaces, which is more in the northern end of the city. And then we have, community restaurants and smaller places in our south end as well. So this is showing what restaurants we hit on, and then we wanted to go out and reach all the restaurants. So we actually deployed a team of staff that went out and met with people on the street and did a lot of citizen engagement. Next slide. So the citizen survey number 2 had 258 responses. We had several emails. People wanted to see patio dining, but still were fearing the disease. This is before the indoor section. This was when we were just opening for outdoor. So people had health and safety concerns, and 89 were actually in favor of doing street closures. So we really wanted to hear how people would be open to that idea and seeing where in the city that we could open up the streets. You can go to the next slide. And this is just a little bit more on that survey. It was a Google survey that we deployed that was really great because it gave us the visual information to present to the mayor's office that people wanted to see masks in place. There was concern still. They wanted to see maybe temperature checks by establishments, but there was overall support for things like shared spaces and outdoor spaces. Next slide. And these are just some pictures that we used to guide us. We also created a good deal of signage, and I know Jeffrey touched about the ADA access issues, and we're still running up against that a little bit. We had signs made through our Public Works Department that say, and I wish I could share them here. I wanted to just share them in the chat, but they're really beautiful, and they say, DNB is open for business, please use the other sidewalk. And right now we're directing people to the opposite sidewalk, but we're looking to expand the outdoor dining experience to utilize more pedestrian space so that it's safer and more accessible to all. You can go to the next slide. So this is just a graphic that we pulled from Rhode Island. The Public Health Department put out a graphic that we edited and made public that really helped people visualize what an outdoor dining setup looks like and what are the main elements of that. Next. And we talked about potential street and parking area use plans. So these were the potential areas, which is downtown, which is on Purchase Street and Acushnet Ave. We talked about a one-way or a full closure. We had questions about whether it would be nights or weekends. It needed designated curbside pickup, and what kind of barriers for safety, what kind of types of barriers we could use. So we actually ended up just now publishing a guidance document on our website that has a little bit more of that, sort of pulling off what other communities are doing to have examples of attractive barriers and attractive planter systems, things like that. Next, please. So we're talking about parklets. We have put in for a MassDOT grant, like many of the other communities in our area, to expand on what we have for a city to offer parklets to people, which is the, the platform system, the planters, sanitizer stations, things like temporary bike racks. You can go to next. These are just some more examples of parklets that we showed to the group. Next. And this is a very typical setup that we showed with our permitting team. So again, we work off the View Permit software in-house. We had 35 permits issued just recently through that View Permit software in the past month. So that's a permit sign off of about 6 people sign off on that. And what it looks like is constantly in question. So we work off sketches people get to us. We actually have technical assistance that's being offered through UMass Interior Design Program that we're partners with. We've been talking to design professionals in statewide that have been interested in helping out these local enterprises with, what does a cafe area look like and what are the best practices. Go to the next slide. And then we looked at the downtown locations more specifically with some mapping. You can go to the next slide. So these are just some maps that my staff was wonderful to create when we were kind of hit with this COVID thing, and we were just jumping at this chance to do something really progressive in planning. So these are areas that we've been discussing for other reasons throughout the city anyway, and we were wanting to activate these spaces, how we could take this public realm and make it more accessible, aesthetically pleasing, and just usable for outdoor seating. Next, please. These are just some more maps of that. So potential use of dining parklets, where could we have city-owned space versus sidewalk seating, privately and publicly owned dining areas, and some map connections. Next. And then this is up on the avenue. So this is the International Marketplace, the Acushnet Avenue locations. We talked about more parklets up on the avenue. We've already had some restaurants that have sought to do that. You can go to the next. And using those spaces and designating things one way, removing parking. So a lot of this was conversation with our Public Works Department and our Building Department, and we use these graphics to help us with those conversations. We also utilize Street Mix, which I started using with SRPEDD once, and it's just a wonderful tool for communicating what kind of cross sections are possible on the street and how you can communicate that to the Public Works Department quickly, and they can toss it back to you and say, no, we don't want 14-foot lanes, we want 12-foot lanes. You can put that back and forth really quickly. Next slide, please. And then this is more of the survey, and really going back to the survey and seeing what the survey said. Would we be interested in a beer garden type of space in Custom House Square? So that's our downtown park. And so I appeared before the park board and asked for the approval to pursue dining in the parks, and that's something else that we're doing with the park board's approval. With the help of the Parks and Recreation Director, we're looking at what we can do to enhance our parks for dining opportunities, and part of that was putting in for some extra grant money to give us sanitizer stations, more temporary signage, more temporary barriers, more aesthetically pleasing barriers. Next. And then a big part of this was the branding and outreach arm. Some of these smaller establishments, especially the small restaurants, little holes in the wall, mom and pop places, don't really have a communication strategy. So we teamed up with our DNB Inc., which is our downtown group of citizen volunteers and just think tank. It's fantastic. They have a small marketing budget, so they were helping us with some signage, but then we also have our marketing and tourism department with the city that jumped on board and helped with a communication strategy there with our groups with Love the Ave and our downtown squad. Our ward counselors were a huge support in all of this. They made a ton of phone calls, and I was texting and calling with all of them pretty much consistently through the progress of this implementation. And we still offer direct assistance in the form of technical assistance to all the CAFE permit applicants. So if they come to us with a sketch, we can come back to them and say, well, what do you really want to do here? Here are some examples, and work through it a little bit more. I think you can go to the next slide. So these are just some of the more outreach recommendations that came from our outreach group, was to creating designs that were key to outdoor dining, getting that on our social media, just having more constant contact emails. We have just so many great resources within the city that were on this working group that we just were able to blast things out. And there was a ton of wonderful posts on Instagram and Facebook and some of these local social media showing and highlighting the improvements and what we could do in the streets. I think that's it. So then phase 3 and 4, that's our next phases that we're in now. We are checking back, and it's an iterative process. So the restaurant group has somewhat disbanded and moved into these subcommittees. So as I said, we put in for a MassDOT grant for all these improvements that we can put in place. And hopefully once we get that, crossing my fingers, some of that, we can move some of these pieces to really expand on the outdoor dining experience downtown and on the Ave, and then see if there's other clusters within the city that could be explored as well. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you, Tabitha. That's great. And it sounds like New Bedford's doing some really exciting things. Before we move on to the town of Wareham, I just want to let everyone know that we'll be saving questions for the end of the speakers. So I see some raised hands, so I just want to let you guys know. But without further ado, Ken, I want to give you the mic.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm the Director of Planning and Community Development in the town of Wareham. I'm also the clerk of the Redevelopment Authority and the chairman of the Road Commission. Next slide. This is downtown Wareham. In the middle of the photo is the Main Street, which is also Route 6. The cluster of buildings on the left, which are the more intensive block, and to the left of that again is what's called Merchants Way. It's actually a town-owned parcel of land that's used mostly for parking and access to the rear of the buildings. Next slide, please. The hospital in the left upper foreground background is undergoing an expansion now, and it will be connecting down to Main Street in a new project. Next slide, please. And what we have here is the old train station, which was probably built back in the 1970s, on the lower left-hand side, beside the railroad tracks that are running along the waterfront. And to the right is the new MBTA train stop for the Cape Flyer at this point, hopefully for some commuter rail in the future as an option. The focus is on this the old train station that has an alleyway that connects it to Main Street. Next slide, please. In 2013, the Waterfield Design Group came in and did a concept for an intermodal transportation center, which highlighted the connection of the alleyway to Main Street into the old train station, with an access and a rail crossing to go out onto the river, the Wareham River. This concept has been kept in the back burner for a while, with the idea that it's an expensive undertaking to create the boardwalk that would run from downtown all the way up to the Tremont Nail Factory, which is about a 3/4 of a mile long in distance. the vision was seen as an opportunity to drive change along the rear of the properties. The Redevelopment Authority now is looking to have the blocks on Main Street redeveloped as well, and we're looking at zoning for that purpose to change try to get some private reinvestment in place in town. Next slide, please. This is what they had anticipated to do at the old train station, which was to expand it for a true intermodal center with activities there. But we saw this as an opportunity for near-term needs. At the left of the building is men's and women's bathrooms and mechanical room. And to the right is the area that we're using to create a space. One of the original ideas was to have a entertainment event, some music events at that location. But we saw the opportunity to have something a little bit more elaborate. Next slide, please. This was the concept for the alleyway that leads to the train station and has a great view out to the Wareham River. It's just a gorgeous waterfront at this location. And what we did was, and the next slide shows our attempt to create the space for outdoor dining. The Jersey barriers I don't think are necessarily the classiest thing to put up, but it's a safety issue. Luckily, there are security level planters that can have some vegetation in them and also can stop a vehicle from going through. And we're planning on putting those in and improving this space here. This is actively used. It's by the adjoining restaurant, El Mariachi. There are 9 restaurants downtown though, and there's a brewery that's coming and another proposal for another restaurant. So we have the opportunity to get this space set up for the outdoor dining for these businesses. Also the opportunity for event space as well. In the next slide, just talking about a couple of the improvements that are going to be made, some lighting, some security gates, tables and chairs, and the planters that all will be used to secure the space and to make it available for the restaurants to operate, as well as as others. In the next slide, have the idea of this being a lottery system we're looking at right now for sign up for a week for outdoor dining for the restaurants. The idea that we could also have food trucks parked beside and serve to customers in that area as well, and have this available also for the street fairs and the other cultural events that take place downtown. This is our concept, and luckily we got some funding from the MassDOT. So we're busily ordering the equipment and fixtures to start creating this space, and we hope to have it ready by the end of September. And that's our project.
Thank you, Ken. That sounds very exciting for Wareham. I'm excited to see the final results. And before we move on to a discussion, I want to open the floor to Catherine Fisher from MassDOT to talk a little bit about funding opportunities.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me and including me today. I don't have slides, actually, because the slide deck that we use is all pictures from all of your wonderful projects. So I wanted to give you guys a chance to show them off. Very briefly, because I know I'm the last person on the agenda here. I am managing what's called the Shared Streets and Spaces program. A bunch of people have mentioned it today, which is really heartening to hear. The program is in some ways similar to the Complete Streets program, which people are probably familiar with, but it's intended to fund much quicker projects, not big capital projects, and really projects that are responsive to the moment that we are in ways that everybody here today has been describing. We are really particularly looking for projects that give new and more space to bicyclists and pedestrians. One thing that we have been getting is quite a bit of projects to just sort of repair basic sidewalks, not really expand space. That's less what we're looking for. We want more space. We want space for dining and for commerce to be outside. We want more space for school kids to be getting to school safely, walking and biking. Anything that kind of uses this moment, uses the need for social distancing to use new areas particularly in our downtowns, but also in neighborhoods, particularly around schools. Sort of the MassDOT nexus that we see is that we are looking for cities and towns that are in some way using or repurposing existing transportation infrastructure. So a lot of what we're seeing is, temporary removals of parking lanes to put in dining, to expand a sidewalk, maybe to test out a bike lane or a bus lane. We're also getting some parking lots being reused in certain kinds of ways. And we are seeing, filling in of sidewalks where they're maybe missing, or as I say, testing out bike lanes or bus lanes. Those are all wonderful types of projects. We are just this week reviewing our 4th round of applications. The program will stay open until late September. There is no advantage to getting something in quickly. We're not trying to spend all the money right at the beginning. We really want people to take time to put together thoughtful proposals that really do kind of meet the parameters of the program. If there's public input that needs to be done, wants to be done, please don't rush that in order to get something to us quickly. We are trying to get responses back to municipalities absolutely as quickly as we can. There are quite a few cases, it's turning out, where we're actually going back for more information before we make a decision about funding, so please don't be offended or worried if that happens. There are many cases where we can't quite tell what the project is proposing or how it relates to COVID, so we need to kind of push on that a little bit. But I really encourage folks to check out the website, in part because one of the things we're most excited about is that we have access to free technical assistance resources, free to us, free to you guys, funded by the Bar Foundation, to help municipalities either refine an idea they may have or come up with an idea if they don't have one, that will help to kind of meet what we're looking for as part of the program. So please check out the website, check out the technical assistance, ask any questions either right now or online. We have someone whose full-time job is to answer questions, so she's becoming expert in everything we're getting coming in. So again, excited, happy to answer any questions, thrilled to hear all these ideas, and hope that we will see some applications coming in as a result of this. And thank you.
Great, thank you. So we did want to save some time for questions at the end. If anyone has questions that they want to speak up on, please raise your hand and we'll call on you. Additionally, you can enter a question through the Q&A, and if you'd like to direct it to a specific speaker, that would be great.
Excellent. And just in terms of a little bit of logistics, so as Lizette just mentioned, if you raise your hand in the Zoom platform, what we'll do is we'll offer you to come off of being muted and join the conversation for a few minutes. And if you could ask your quick question or comment, it would be great to re-engage the panelists in terms of answering some of those questions as well. So feel free at any point in time to raise your hand. And for those that have dialed in via a phone, you might hit us, I think it's a *6 or *9 to be able to come off mute as well. So let's open up for that conversation. And if you don't want to come on audio, if you want to send some questions from the Q&A, we'd love to get to some of those as well. So, and as we're letting people raise their hands and get ready for some of their questions, I think what we can try to do is maybe talk about some of the ones that came up during our Q&A session. So Lil, I'm not sure if you wanted to give us a couple highlights of some of the questions that are coming so far.
Yeah, I actually have 3 questions, and I think maybe Kate would be able to answer them. So I'm going to ask them in the order I received them. So the first one says, outdoor dining is great in the summer and fall. What will happen over the winter, the cold weather for dining?
So that's honestly a question that we have as well. I think it is a question for municipalities to be thinking about, particularly as the summer seems to be flying by. You know, from the MassDOT sort of grant program perspective, we are interested in projects and ideas that have a little bit more of a lifespan than just between now and Labor Day. So if municipalities are thinking about, you know, how could we convert something into something that could at least work in the fall, if not in the winter, and if nothing else, you know, we are funding umbrellas, we're funding picnic tables, we're funding tables if they're, or funding chairs if they're part of sort of a larger project. We're going to want to see those used again next summer. So I can certainly give input on that, but I actually think that's a question more for municipalities, kind of how are they conceiving of this transitioning into a colder season.
Okay, next question. Can you address businesses abutting a state road?
Well, I can certainly address a project proposed to be on a state road, which I think is that question. So in the materials for the grant program, we at a high level kind of lay out a process for municipalities seeking to do these kinds of projects on state roads. We have not gotten many of those, and I fear that is in part because people either don't want to or don't know how to kind of like wrangle with MassDOT over state-owned roads, but we really are encouraging municipalities to do it. We know there are a lot of places where state-owned roads double as main streets or village centers, and we don't want municipalities to just feel like those projects should not be considered. They need to bounce to us kind of early on in the decision and making process so that we can be part of it.
Okay, and the last question in the Q&A. Do any of the participants have experience with creating shared or closed streets in residential neighborhoods? And if so, how have equity issues been incorporated into the decision process?
I can say for us, most of what we're seeing is in, you know, commercial centers, big or small. We are seeing some shared streets that are around sort of safe routes to schools projects. But where I live in Somerville, there are some shared streets that are truly residential. So they are popping up in different types of places, but most of what we've seen for grants is commercial.
Right, and just to piggyback on that as well, I think when you look at some of the regional things and national and international things, I think it's the city of Vancouver, they had a 20-year plan to be able to really connect major parts of their city together through many different types of access and connections and shared streets and pedestrian-only streets. We are seeing some communities go back to things like those open space plans, their mobility plans, and try to temporarily put in some of that infrastructure that they thought might come 10, 15 years later as well. So I would encourage you to go back and look at some of your open space and recreation plans and what some of those recommendations might have been in those places. Because while we're talking primarily about downtowns and shared streets in very urban settings, the idea of connecting people to open spaces and recreational resources and the open space network in general, I think is a pretty important thing as well. I'd also look for state agencies like Department of Conservation, Recreation to see what they're doing in terms of opening up their trails and better access for some of the assets that they control as well. And I have to believe that happens in other states. So just wanted to offer up those couple of quick perspectives. So Lil, was that all that we had in terms of the Q&A session?
That is so far, but I actually have a question if no one minds. So Kate, this is for you. So you said that umbrellas and picnic tables and whatnot were included in the grant list. For the question on what happens in the winter cold weather, are those propane heaters that I've seen at some other outdoor dining venues, like down the Cape, is that part of the grant list, purchase list?
So it's not something that we call out by name in the program materials, in part because when we sort of came up with this idea and established it 6 weeks ago, we were really thinking of it as kind of a summer program. But it's certainly something that I thought of, and it's something that I've seen used all over the place, and they can be very nice. I think that the challenge for us is that, ultimately this is still a mobility and a public health program. So the more expensive the kind of accessories get, just the harder it can get to justify them on our end. But if it's a really good project that has more pedestrian space and more bike space and a bus lane, but also has tables and propane heaters, that's a different situation than like just an application for heaters or tables. there needs to be that kind of mobility, expanded mobility for walking and biking and transit that comes along with it.
Great,
And
thanks.
I had a question for our panelists as well here, and maybe this one for Tabitha. It's impressive the list of things that you've moved forward and the resources that you brought to the table. I guess for the folks that are viewing here, are there any like lessons learned or things that would help people move forward into that? Because it could probably seem daunting, all of those things you need to deploy within days, if not weeks. Any lessons learned that you might want to share?
Yeah, collaboration, listening. I think that the team in the city was successful because we got started with a mission. You know, we all got geared toward that mission, and then each of us had our separate things that we were good at that we brought to the table, and so we kind of jumped in and out of these subcommittees. So I think that don't think that you have to do it alone. Most of these reopening plans are being developed through ad hoc groups of citizen volunteers and boards and people that just happen to also be know an epidemiologist or be also a staff sergeant of something. So there are people that are in your community that know a lot of things that you can draw upon, and I think that listening and really having an open group rapport is helpful.
Excellent.
I have another question on the Q&A. So someone says, New Bedford has the ferry terminals that drop off tourists. I'm part of the Conservation Law Foundation, Healthy Neighborhood Grant, HNEF, and YMCA South Coast. My resident researcher would like to do a wayfinding sign, do wayfinding signs on the sidewalk to the West Beach and restaurants in the South End along Route 18. Would this be an idea of what you're looking for?
I guess I could speak to that, and I could talk to them offline about a wayfinding program. Wayfinding is something that I'm very passionate about, and we would like to see more of in the city.
Okay.
And I have a question for Ken. It was interesting to see how a lot of our communities over the years have planned for what their future is and kind of waiting for the funding or that critical opportunity to test drive some of that. I guess I'm curious, how is that test drive going and the example that you showed, and is it really building momentum towards maybe helping you get more momentum and perhaps some funding in place to do a permanent solution in there?
It absolutely is, and that's what's so great about it. Is it was a near-term, easy opportunity, some low-hanging fruit to try to get activity in the downtown and start to people thinking about the larger plan for change and redevelopment. You know, what we're trying to do is get private money to come and invest in the downtown, and what we have to do is but with a little bit of careful expenditure is improve so that we start to make the place a little bit more attractive and look like an opportunity for change. We have an opportunity zone over the downtown as well, and we've had some people come in and talk about opportunities that they see there. There's a parcel on the south side of downtown across Route 6, past the hospital. That's on the waterfront. That has a redevelopment plan that's being developed for it that is kind of exciting and can make a big difference about making this a destination location. So our little bit of work, putting up Jersey barriers so that there can be some outdoor dining, getting people to think about the use of the public spaces, and then getting the opportunity to make a little bit nicer space as a result. I think is the way you want to slowly build, get your foot in the door and start to advance the downtown plan as a whole.
That makes sense. Yeah, it's interesting to see how momentum gets built in some of these locations. So Lizette, did you have another comment or question?
I'm sorry, continue. I didn't want to jump in there.
Yeah, no, I was just saying it's interesting that I think a lot of our communities struggle with going from idea to implementation. And what I've actually found kind of rewarding in a way is again, as planners, urban designers, transportation engineers, and so forth, just imagining how these policy guides and how these visions for communities and this mode shift that we've all been seeing probably in the last 10 to 15 years about valuing transit, valuing the ability to walk and bike, has really started to manifest itself. And when you walk through some of these communities and see it, like, again, as I mentioned before, it's really, we're seeing all these case studies really right in front of us as well. So the idea that if we like some of these solutions, I guess, how do we as communities and as agencies continue to support them and move them forward over time? It's really just going to be interesting to see what happens 6 to 9 months from right now and the lessons that we've learned from this. I know Trish and I were talking a little bit about this too, and maybe Trish, you can chime in here. The idea of, let's say that a community is successful and they want to do some of this work. It's not necessarily as easy as saying like, well, let's just make it a permanent solution. What are some of the steps that you might need to do to justify, and some of the data and things you might need to do to help you get to that next level when all these vehicles go back on the road? So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so, it's really important to make sure that whatever you're implementing, and Catherine can attest to this, I'm sure, being part of the state, is, you want to make sure that it's a true solution to a problem. So, you do have to analyze it. You have to make sure that whatever you're implementing makes sense. And if that means that you have to do additional studies in terms of land use or traffic studies and mobility issues, and, making sure that there's proper accessibility to destinations, downtowns, or, places that people want to go, you need to do that. So, study it, make sure that the designs meet state and federal standards, especially ADA compliance is something that's really super important. So yeah, Jeffrey, it's interesting though, because this is a short-term problem in 2020, but the whole mode shift in mobility has been something that MassDOT has been striving for with healthy transportation policies for years. And this is just demonstrating the success rate and how people do want to walk more, and they don't have to be so reliant on fossil fuels in their vehicles. So it really is something that I think long-term is going to make a mark on how we move around, the world. It's not even the state, it's the world. So it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting era that we're in right now.
I would totally echo that. And we, one of the sort of challenges that we have given to ourselves at MassDOT is to see which of our many, many processes and requirements and standards we can let go for the purposes of this program, given that most things are temporary. But as Patricia mentioned, ADA is non-negotiable, and that has to be handled appropriately because we're giving access to everybody. And basic safety, obviously non-negotiable. We don't want a car plowing into a group of diners. So there is. It's kind of a test for all of us. What can we do quickly that meets the moment, but that does also sort of honor our larger values and requirements.
Great. So I think we might want to pivot to maybe asking some questions, I think, Lizeth?
Yeah, I actually had a question for Kate regarding the grantee awards. I know there's a final reporting requirement. What performance measures or data and information is MassDOT looking for?
That is an excellent question, and it's actually something that we're trying to figure out right now. And I would welcome ideas and input. What we have thought about so far, and this is still very much a work in progress, is there is sort of a basic report that we lay out in the program materials that every grantee will need to kind of give back to us, which includes photographs and lessons learned and sort of the experience with implementation, and if there was any public reaction, kind of what they got from it. We're also hoping to work through the Bar Foundation with some program evaluation experts, people who are more expert than I am, to kind of look at a number of, not every project, but a number of sort of representative projects. But there is no question that the metrics are not the same as what we always look at. We typically look at safety and mobility and throughput and all that kind of stuff. There are other things going on here, and there are other things that we are trying to privilege and prioritize. So figuring out what we're going to measure is complex, and is something we're wrestling with a little bit as transportation people. So I would love input from that. And I think it also matters whether something is considering becoming permanent, or if it's really just like a 2 or 3 month thing and then it's done, and that that means something different than if it's like, hey, this has been really great, what would it take to make it permanent? So any ideas are welcome.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I know data can be used to bolster decisions and say, hey, I know this was permanent, but maybe we want to keep this for next year or throughout the year, that type of deal with weather permitting, or if it's bicycling, that's something that can stay up year round. So do you recommend that as municipalities begin to think of these projects that they integrate these types of metrics in their planning process in order to measure them later on?
So we've had a couple of municipalities who have asked us as part of their grant application, like whether the funds could be used to do some of the evaluation for themselves, and the answer is yes, absolutely. You know, we will do some of our own when we figure out how to do it, but absolutely. And I think to the extent that municipalities can suggest to us either how they think their own projects should be evaluated or how they would suggest more generally, absolutely. Very helpful for everybody to be thinking about those kinds of things. Not something we're requiring, but absolutely helpful.
Great, yeah, that's super useful to know as I know we try to get ideas flowing in the region and get people interested in this. So Jeffrey, I don't know if we have any more questions either on the Q&A or any raised hands.
Nope.
And I think no one's raised their hand. So maybe if we want to close out, I know we had a couple of polling questions. We can maybe go to those, Lizette, if you'd like to.
Yeah, for sure. If you want to launch the poll.
Right, so for those that are participating in the Zoom platform, we have a couple of questions for you today about some of the content and the topic that you've seen here. It's always just helpful to get some feedback about these. And Lizette, if you want to maybe talk about the questions here a little bit for context.
Sure, so part of it was that we wanted to really get people thinking about reusing their public space, and we were hoping that through this webinar we could provide some different examples of doing so. And maybe you can envision this in your own municipality now after seeing some local examples, and if they can do it, you can do it too. So we'd love to know more about that if it's something you're interested in. And also moving forward, what else we can provide to our communities to assist in their response to COVID, to just, you know, support their communities.
Right. So at any point in time, you can go ahead and take that poll, and we'll let that poll be open for a little bit to give people time to answer those questions as well. And then what we're able to do once folks are finished taking the poll is share some of the results on these couple of questions here just to see where folks are. So we're seeing some of the results as they come in right now. So I see that we have about maybe 10 or so more people. So if you want to take the poll, that would help us all out. We really appreciate that as well. Excellent. Give that just a few more seconds. And I think maybe as we're starting to think about closing, if the panelists had anything that they'd like to say in terms of like any closing thoughts from their perspectives of observations or other things that weren't covered, to give you the final opportunity to raise one more comment from our panelists. Not sure if anyone has anything. Tabitha?
I'll just say that it's a really exciting time to be a planner. I think that myself and my staff members got involved in this restaurant reopening strategy because it leads to this shared discussion about shared spaces and outdoor spaces that are long been neglected and have long been something that we've wanted to see happen. So I think we probably share that sentiment with most of the planners on this call, that it's an exciting time to be a planner, that things are changing, but not necessarily all for the bad. So let's see what we can do and be progressive about this next step.
Agreed. Totally agree.
I think that this idea of looking creatively at your community and your public spaces and thinking about how they can be used, the idea that something that may be seen as an eyesore is actually something that is productive if set up in the right condition and situation.
Agreed. That's right. So how are we doing on the poll here? So I think, why don't we close out the poll? I think we've given folks enough time here. So thank you for taking those as well. And here are the final results. Really appreciate that as well. And I'm not sure if any other panelists have some closing thoughts. Kate or Trish, any other things that you want to mention before we close out? So Lizette, back to you. Do you want to close us out with the last couple of questions we've got and a formal ending? So thank you.
Yeah, sure. So before we close and before I let you go enjoy the rest of your day, we did want to just get another quick set of questions regarding your experiences with the webinar. And in order to get AICP credits and stuff like that, we just want to be able to provide the best experience possible. So if you'd like to answer those questions, we would greatly appreciate it as well.
Yeah, so we'll close out this poll here officially, and then we'll open up our second poll that has a few questions in there, and feel free to answer those at any point in time as we close things out. But your feedback, as Lizeth mentioned, is always helpful, just in terms of making this as beneficial and helpful as possible. So we appreciate that too.
Yeah, I want to take the opportunity and the last few minutes to thank all our attendees for listening, for joining us today, but also especially our panelists and speakers for sharing your experiences and how we can get this going in our region and how we can start thinking creatively, as you said, Tabitha. So thank you to everyone.
Yeah. And Lizeth, we just like to say thank you as well. We really appreciated it. It was great to see everybody virtually here and have such great comments from our panelists too. So I just wanted to say thanks on our behalf. It was really great working with you guys to pull this whole session together. So I'm so excited as a planner. I think Tabitha mentioned, like, it's a great time, all troubles aside, to be trying to be proactive with your communities. And I'm super excited to see what comes out of this and make the world a better place, frankly, because I think we can do it. So I'm excited about the upside. And we got to look for the upside too, not just the negative side. So looking forward to that.
Thank you, everybody. That's the inspiration we need. I know I need.
Absolutely.
Seriously, if anyone has questions, Jeffrey and Lizeth know how to get me, so please don't hesitate to be in touch.
And I do want to mention that we will, thank you. I do want to mention that we'll be posting the slides on the SRPEDD website and the recording as well. I've included our contact information in case you'd like to follow up with any questions. Maybe you think of it later. SRPEDD also has a history of providing community technical assistance, and we are happy to talk to our communities about any projects they might be pursuing related to adapting public space. And you know, we do a wide variety of different projects. So feel free to reach out to us for that. And again, thank you so much for joining us.